You're a Soviet pilot in 1944, flying over the Eastern Front. Your radio crackles to life. Black Devil spotted. Repeat, Black Devil in the area. Your hands start to shake. Not from the cold, from fear, because you know what that means. Somewhere in the sky above you, there's a German pilot who has shot down more aircraft than anyone in human history. 350 to confirmed kills. A number so absurd, so incomprehensible, that even today, 80 years later, no one has come close. His name was Erich Hartmann, and this is the story of how a young man who never wanted to be a warrior became the most lethal fighter pilot the world has ever known. Erich Hartmann wasn't supposed to be a killer. Born in 1922 in Weissach, Germany, he grew up in a world still reeling from the First World War. His father was a doctor. His mother, Elizabeth, was a pioneering woman, one of the first female glider pilots in Germany. She taught young Erich to fly before he could even drive a car. But here's the thing about Hartmann that makes his story so fascinating. He was gentle, thoughtful. His childhood friends described him as someone who avoided fights, who preferred hiking and gliding over anything remotely violent. When war broke out in 1939, Hartmann was just 17, more interested in becoming a flight instructor than a fighter pilot. The Luftwaffe had other plans. By 1942, Hitler's war machine was consuming young men at an apocalyptic rate. The Eastern Front was a meat grinder. Pilots were being shot down faster than Germany could replace them. Training programs that once took years were compressed into months. Boys barely out of school were being strapped into Messerschmitt 109s and sent east to face Soviet pilots who had already survived years of brutal combat. Erich Hartmann was one of those boys when he arrived at his first combat unit, Water 52, in October 1942. The veterans took one look at him and sighed. Another rookie, another kid who probably wouldn't last a week. They weren't entirely wrong to be pessimistic. Hartmann's first combat mission was a disaster. He got separated from his squadron, panicked, and nearly crashed his plane trying to land back at base with his landing gear up. His commanding officer chewed him out so badly that Hartmann genuinely considered whether he was cut out for this. His second mission, even worse. He finally got his first aerial combat experience, got overexcited, and fired at an enemy aircraft from way too far away. Wasted all his ammunition, accomplished nothing. Then, trying to return to base, he got lost, ran out of fuel, and had to crash land in a field behind German lines. 2 missions, 2 complete failures. Most pilots would have been reassigned. Most commanders would have written him off, but something strange happened. One of the squadron's most experienced pilots, a man named Edmund Rossmann, saw something in Hartmann. Maybe it was his flying skill, which was actually exceptional. Maybe it was his willingness to learn, or maybe Rossmann just felt sorry for him. Whatever the reason, Rossmann took Hartmann under his wing. And he taught him something that would change everything. Seedy-side attack coffee. That was Rossmann's mantra, and he drilled it into Hartmann relentlessly. See the enemy before they see you. Decide if you have the advantage. If you do, attack with overwhelming force. If you don't, break off and go get coffee. Live to fight another day. It sounds simple, almost boring. But in the chaos of aerial combat, where split-second decisions mean the difference between life and death, this philosophy was revolutionary. Most fighter pilots in World War II were aggressive to the point of recklessness. They hunted, they chased. They engaged in dramatic dogfights, spinning and weaving through the sky like something out of a movie. It looked heroic. It also got them killed. Hartmann took a different approach. He studied his enemy. He learned that Soviet pilots, while brave and skilled, often flew in predictable patterns. They followed doctrine. They relied on their wingmen. They expected Germans to behave like Germans. So Hartmann decided not to. He would stalk his prey like a predator. Position himself with the sun at his back so he was invisible. Get as close as possible, sometimes within 50 meters, closer than most pilots dared. Then, when his enemy had no idea he was even there, he would strike with a single, devastating burst of gunfire. And then he would vanish. The Soviets started calling him Chorniy Chort, the Black Devil, because his Messerschmitt 109 had a distinctive black tulip pattern painted on the nose, and because he seemed to appear out of nowhere, strike, and disappear like a demon. But here's what made Hartmann truly different. He didn't hunt for glory. While other aces competed for kills, painted elaborate scorecards on their aircraft, and reveled in their celebrity, Hartmann stayed quiet. He refused to take unnecessary risks. He wouldn't engage unless conditions were perfect. He turned down multiple opportunities for promotion because he didn't want to command from the ground. He wanted to fly. His superiors found this infuriating. His wingmen found it reassuring. Because if you flew with Hartmann, you came home. His philosophy wasn't just about killing the enemy, it was about survival. And in a war where the average life expectancy of a fighter pilot on the Eastern Front was measured in weeks, survival was everything. By the summer of 1943, Hartmann had 50 victories. By the end of that year, 150. The number kept climbing at a pace that seemed impossible, but numbers don't tell the full story. Erich Hartmann should have died at least a dozen times. Let me tell you about one of them. August 20th, 1943. Hartmann and his wingmen are patrolling over Soviet-controlled territory when they spot a formation of enemy aircraft. Hartmann does his usual calculation: approach from the sun, get close, strike fast. He lines up behind a Soviet bomber, closes to point-blank range, and opens fire. The bomber explodes, but here's the problem. Hartmann is so close that he flies directly through the debris. Chunks of burning metal slam into his Messerschmitt. His engine starts smoking. Oil sprays across his windscreen. He's losing altitude fast, and he's 20 miles behind enemy lines. He tries to nurse the plane back to German territory, but it's no use. The engine seizes. He's going down. Hartmann bails out, parachutes into a sunflower field, and watches his beloved Bf 109 cartwheel into the ground and explode. He's alive, but he's in the middle of Soviet-controlled Ukraine. If they catch him, he's dead, or worse, he starts running. Within minutes, he hears voices, Soviet soldiers. They're searching the area. Hartmann dives into the sunflowers and holds his breath. The soldiers pass within meters of him. He can see their boots. They don't find him. He waits until dark, then starts moving west. He walks all night. At dawn, he hears vehicles. Soviet trucks. He hides again. This goes on for 18 hours. No food, no water. Just the fear that at any moment someone will spot him. Finally, as the sun is setting the next day, he sees German positions. He sprints toward them, screaming in German so they don't shoot him. He makes it, barely. Most pilots would take a break after something like that. Request a few days of leave. Process the trauma. Hartmann was back in the air the next morning. This pattern repeated itself throughout the war. He was shot down 16 times, but here's the remarkable thing: only once was he shot down by enemy aircraft. Every other time it was mechanical failure, debris, or flying through the explosion of a plane he'd just destroyed. He was never wounded, not once. The Soviets couldn't understand it. They put a bounty on his head. Any pilot who shot down the Black Devil would receive a medal and a promotion. Soviet commanders briefed their pilots specifically on Hartmann's tactics. They warned them about the black tulip. They told them not to engage. It didn't matter. By 1944, Hartmann's kill count had passed 200. He was being summoned to Berlin to receive medals from Hitler himself. The Nazi propaganda machine wanted to turn him into a poster boy for the Aryan warrior ideal. Hartmann hated it. He hated the politics. Hated the parades, hated being away from his squadron. On one occasion, he met Hitler and found the Führer's handshake weak and unpleasant. He refused to have his picture taken for propaganda purposes. He just wanted to fly and protect his comrades, but the war was turning. and even the Black Devil couldn't stop what was coming. By early 1945, Germany was collapsing. The Eastern Front was disintegrating. Soviet forces were pushing into Germany itself. The Luftwaffe was running out of fuel, planes, and pilots. Hartmann's squadron was being ordered to fly missions that everyone knew were pointless. The war was lost, but Hartmann kept flying. Not for Hitler, not for the Reich, for his men. Because as long as he was in the air, he could protect the retreating German columns from Soviet aircraft. He could buy time for civilians to evacuate. He could give his wingmen a chance to survive one more day. On May 8, 1945, the day Germany surrendered, Hartmann flew his final combat mission. His 1,404th sortie, he shot down a Soviet Yak-9, his 352nd victory. Then he landed, gathered his squadron, and told them something that saved their lives. "We're surrendering to the Americans, not the Soviets." He knew what would happen to Luftwaffe pilots captured by the Red Army. They would be interrogated, tortured, or executed. The Americans, at least, followed the Geneva Convention. So Hartmann led his entire unit west, flying low to avoid Soviet patrols, and landed at an American air base in Czechoslovakia. They surrendered. It should have been the end of the story. It wasn't. The Americans, as part of their agreement with the Soviet Union, handed Hartmann and his men over to the Red Army. It was a betrayal that Hartmann never forgot. The Soviets threw him into a prisoner of war camp. Then, in a mockery of justice, they put him on trial. The charges, war crimes. The Black Devil, they claimed, had murdered innocent Soviet pilots. The evidence, his kill count, never mind that every one of those kills was in legitimate combat. Never mind that Hartmann had never harmed a prisoner or attacked anyone who had bailed out. To the Soviets, his effectiveness was proof of criminality. They sentenced him to 25 years hard labor. For the next 10.5 years, Erich Hartmann languished in Soviet gulags. He was beaten, starved, forced to work in mines. Other prisoners were told he was a Nazi war criminal. Some tried to kill him, but Hartmann survived. Just like he always had, he refused to sign false confessions. He organized resistance among the prisoners. He endured interrogations and solitary confinement with the same calm focus he'd shown in combat. He waited. Finally, in 1955, after West German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer negotiated with Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, Hartmann was released. He returned to Germany a changed man, thinner, older, haunted by the years in captivity. But still alive, when Hartmann came home, West Germany was rebuilding, and it was building an air force. The new Bundesluftwaffe wanted the best. They wanted Hartmann. Despite everything he'd been through, despite the fact that he could have retired quietly and lived off his reputation, he agreed to serve again. But the new Air Force was different. It was part of NATO. It flew American jets. And it was commanded, in part, by former Allied officers who had very specific ideas about how things should be done. Hartmann clashed with them almost immediately. He thought the new fighter jets, the F-10 for starfighters, were death traps. He was right. The F-104 would go on to kill dozens of Bundesluftwaffe pilots. He said so publicly. He criticized procurement decisions. He refused to play politics. In 1970, he was forced into early retirement. But here's where the story gets interesting. Because after the Cold War ended and the Soviet archives opened, historians finally got to examine the records of Hartmann's combat claims, and they were accurate. Every single one of his 350 victories could be verified through Soviet records, witness testimony, or wreckage analysis. Some aces from World War II had inflated their scores. Hartmann hadn't. If anything, he'd undercounted. There were instances where he should have claimed victories but didn't bother with the paperwork. The man who the Soviets had called a war criminal was, by all accounts, an honest soldier who had simply been terrifyingly good at his job. Hartmann spent his later years quietly. He gave occasional interviews. He attended reunions with his old squadron mates. He never bragged about his record. When asked about his 350 victories, he would often say, "I'm proud I brought my men home." He died in 1993, at the age of 71. At his funeral, pilots from around the world attended, Americans, British, even some Russians. Because regardless of what side they'd fought on, they recognized what Hartmann represented: pure skill, professional excellence, and a commitment to survival over glory. So, what do we make of Erich Hartmann? He's a complicated figure. He fought for Nazi Germany, a regime responsible for unimaginable evil. That's a fact we can't ignore, but by all accounts, Hartmann himself was not an ideologue. He wasn't a member of the Nazi Party. He didn't commit atrocities. He was a pilot who flew, fought, and survived in a war he didn't start and couldn't stop. His record of 350 aerial victories will almost certainly never be broken. Modern air combat is completely different. Pilots fire missiles from miles away. Dogfights are rare. The age of ace fighter pilots is over, but Hartmann's legacy isn't just about the numbers. It's about the philosophy: seedy side attack coffee, know your enemy. Choose your battles, strike with precision, survive. It's about loyalty. He protected his wingmen. He led his squadron to safety when the war was lost. He endured 10 years of hell in Soviet prisons rather than betray his principles. And it's about the strange, terrible nature of war itself. How an ordinary man, someone who never wanted to be a warrior, can become the most lethal practitioner of his craft in history. How skill and violence intersect, how the same qualities that make someone a protector can also make them a destroyer. The Soviets called him the Black Devil. His enemies feared him. His wingmen loved him. History remembers him as the greatest fighter pilot who ever lived. But the real Erich Hartmann, the man behind the legend, was far more interesting than any nickname could capture. He was a glider pilot's son who learned to see war not as an adventure but as a problem to be solved. A quiet professional in a world of chaos, a survivor who understood that sometimes the most important victory is simply making it home. 352 times he climbed into his Bf 109, took to the sky over the Eastern Front, and faced the enemy. 352 times he won, and 1,404 times he came home. That's the story of the Black Devil. That's the story of Erich Hartmann. Thanks for watching. If you found this story as fascinating as I did, hit that subscribe button. We've got more incredible stories from history coming your way. What do you think about Hartmann's legacy? Let me know in the comments. And if you want to support the channel, check out the link in the description. See you in the next one.